Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala parasha. This week we have the great zchus of reading Parshas Pinchas. If you'll recall, last year we spent a lot of time talking about why God's anger was kindled against Midian when it seems like Bnos Moab were the ones who sinned against us. An incredible Ramban insight that Midian had what to fear, that Moab had what to fear, Midian didn't. Okay, if people want to look at that, that's very fascinating, and that's what we did last year. This week I want to focus on the rest of the parasha and a whole bunch of interesting things that happen in the parasha. The main portion of the parasha, at least the first half of the parasha, is the count of Bnei Israel. And the count is interesting because not only does it count the total, and not only is it interesting to note that the numbers change and we've gone down in the count, but it counts l'mishpachotam leveit avotam. Right? The count is not just Shevet Yehuda, but it's the families within Shevet Yehuda. And that yields a big machlokas between Rashi and the Ramban about whether the nachalot was given out to the Ba'ei Haaretz or to the Yotzei Mitzrayim and how that would play out. And a whole bunch of interesting things happen along the way. Says the Torah, Ubnei Eliyav Nimuel Vidatan Va'aviram. And as if the Torah just reminded itself, Hu Datan Va'aviram Kiryei Ha'ida Asher Hitzu Al Moshe V'Al Aaron Ba'adat Korach V'Hatzotam Al Adonai. Right? Those are the same Datan Va'aviram who rebelled against Moshe and Aaron. And the Ramban, like most of us is interested in, why is this point so important that it's mentioned even within the count? Right? Why does it have to say it within the count? So says the Ramban, Pasuk Perek Chavav, Pasuk Teth. Hizkir hakatuv zeh lahodia shenishara al hayirusha mimishpachat hapalui linemuel levado. Ramban says you just need to know that there's going to be another pshat in a second. But the first pshat is, the Torah wants you to know that even though Nemuel had 3 sons, Ki Datan va'aviram v'chal Hashem nivlahu. No, because Nemuel had 3 sons, but Dasan va'aviram died, and the Ramban strongly implies here, so did their children, despite the pasuk we're about to read, that the children survived. Right? The pasuk says at the end of that parasha, Uvnei Korach lo mesu, which is again a problem in the Mefarshim and a problem in the Medrashim, because in Parashas Korach it does sound like they died. The Torah is explicit that they died. So the Medrashim that they sort of were swallowed up, but then they were mahar her b'tshuva, and a place opened up below the ground, but above Gehenna, whatever it is. So the first answer is, technically, the Torah just wants you to know Uvnei Eliyav Nimuel v'Datan v'Aviram, but it's only Nimuel because Datan v'Aviram died. But the more significant pshat says, O kedivrei Rabotenu, or like the Gemara, Lirmoz she'avdu chelkam min haaretz, afal pi shehayu mi yotzei Mitzrayim uriyim lenachala. Says the Ramban, the Gemara says, and the Ramban supports this idea, that if you were part of Adat Korach, if you were part of Dasan va'aviram, you lost your nachala. Now it doesn't say this any place in the Torah. There's not even a hint to it in any place in the Torah. But the sense you get is that the fight between Korach and Dasan va'aviram and Moshe Rabbeinu was exceptionally personal. But we'll look at that in a second. Really personal. And it doesn't surprise us at all to find out that one of the punishments for being part of Adat Korach is you lose your nachala. And if we see it here, we see it even more clearly later in the parsha. A fascinating story that happens in the parsha is the Benot Zelophchad. The Benot Zelophchad come to Moshe Rabbeinu and they say, Lama nigara levilti akrivet karban, not levilti akrivet, I'm sorry, Lama nigara, why don't we get a chelek in Eretz Yisrael just because our father doesn't have any sons? Okay? And so there, if you look in Perek Chav Zayin, Pasuk Gimel, the Torah tells us the following. Vatikravna benot Zelophchad ben Chefer ben Gilad ben Machir ben Menashe lemishpechot Menashe ben Yosef ve'ele shmot benotav, etc., etc. Vatamod lifnei Moshe v'nei Elazar kohen v'nei Asim b'chol Eidah Pesach HaMoed Lamor Avinu meit ba'midbar V'hu lo haya b'toch ha'edo hanoadim al Hashem ba'adas korach. So the first thing they say is, you should know, our father had nothing to do with the fight with Korach. Then the strange pasuk the Ramban's going to have to explain. Ki v'cheto meit uvanim lo hayu lo. He died of his own sin. And the Ramban wants to know, like, what does that mean he died of his own sin? Okay? Uvanim lo hayu lo, he didn't have any sons. And then they say, what the pasuk I was thinking before. Lama yigara shem avinu mitoch mishpachto ki ein lo bein tana lanu achuzah b'toch achei aviv avinu vayakrev Moshe et mishpatan lifnei Hashem. Okay, and Moshe is going to take something that they said triggered within Moshe the idea that this is something that has to be given to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That Moshe doesn't know the answer to this. So says the Ramban right there, V'hu lo haya. So first he's going to deal with the technical problem. Then he's going to come back to our issue about whether the descendants of Dasan, Aviran, and Korach were entitled to a nachalot in Eretz Yisrael. So first he says, L'fi sheba'u lomar b'cheto meit, since they came to say that their father Zelophchad died of his own sin, nizkiku lomar lo b'chet mit onanim v'lo ba'adat korach shehitzu ala HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? The sin that he died of was not being part of Adat Korach and complaining about Eretz Yisrael. Ela b'cheto levado. He died of his own sin. V'lo hechti acharim imo lashon Rashi. That's Rashi. V'lo piresh lama hayu ba'ot lomar b'cheto meit. But Rashi doesn't explain why Benot Zelophchad were coming to say that he died of his own sin. What does it mean he died of his own sin? Ela shetomarnu avinu meit bamidbar uvanim lo hayu lo ki chen hara'u laheamer. Aval al dat raboteinu hutzruchu lomar shelo haya ba'adat korach lifi sha'adat korach lo haya lohem chelek ba'aretz. Now the reason why they had to say that they're not part of Adat Korach is because Adat Korach forfeited their claim to Eretz Yisrael. V'chein lamitlonenim sheba Adat Korach, and anybody who was part of it and who complained, ki nishma ze be'et, ki nishma ze ba'am mi beit dino shel Moshe v'chein perish Rabbi Avram says, Ibn Ezra says the same thing, that the din was, if you were part of Adas Korach, you do not get a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. Va'amar chashvu habanot ki lo yirshu hanoadim al Hashem. And the daughters of Zelophchad knew this. And if you challenge HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're not. So the claim that they want a chelek and a nachalot in Eretz Yisrael just because they're daughters and Zelophchad didn't have any sons, it only works if Zelophchad wasn't part of Adat Korach. Now, says the Ramban, he agrees with all this, but now he's a classic Ramban insight. V'da'ati al derech hapshat shamru kacha ba'avur shechashvu shemoshe Rabbeinu haya sonei adat korach yoter mikol achotim shemetu bamidbar. He says the daughters of Zelophchad had a sense, and their sense was that Moshe Rabbeinu hated Korach more than he hated anybody else who complained during the Midbar, and there were plenty of them. And the sense you get is that the Ramban agrees. We don't like to associate Moshe Rabbeinu with hate, but the fact of the matter is the Ramban agrees. If you look in Parashas Korach, you see something fascinating. You see for the first time, Moshe Rabbeinu was so angry, Vayichar Moshe ma'od, Vayomer al Hashem, al teifen al minchatam. Lo chamor achad mehem nasati v'lo harayoti et achad mehem. It's very personal, right? They insulted Moshe personally. They claimed that he was manipulating events for his own personal benefit. And Moshe was hurt by that. And he responded personally. And I think the Ramban is saying here that what Benot Zelophchad are saying is the truth. That Moshe Rabbeinu did in fact take it personally when Adat Korach challenged him. And so, V'amar chashvu abanot ki lo yirshu hanoadim al Hashem. V'da'ati b'derech hapshat shamru kacha ba'avur shechashvu shemoshe Rabbeinu haya sonei adat korach yoter mikol achotim shemetu bamidbar shehem hayu hakamim kinegdo, him personally, not just the failure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't take him to Eretz Yisrael. They challenged Moshe personally. V'hakofrim b'chol ma'asav, and they challenged everything he had done. Everything he had done. V'chashvu ulai b'sinato otam, and the daughters of Zelophchad thought, because Moshe Rabbeinu hated Korach, and if he thought that Zelophchad was part of Adat Korach, Yomar al yehi lo Moshe chesed va'al yehi chonein liyitomav. Moshe Rabbeinu would think, I don't have to be good to any of his descendants. I don't have to be merciful to his orphans. Yizacher avon avotam al Hashem. God should remember his sins. Al kain hodiyuhu ki lo haya mehem. Therefore they said he wasn't part of that group. V'ramzu od she'eino b'meitei magefot aval bamidbar meit al mitato. A strange phrase. Ramban says bamidbar meit al mitato. He died in his bed. Do they have beds in the midbar? I don't know. Let's go on and we'll come back. V'tam ki b'cheto meit amru meit bamidbar va'avono shelo zacha likanes ba'aretz. Whatever he did, maybe the idea is he was responsible for Chet HaMeraglim. Not responsible, but meit bamidbar, of his own sins, of the sin of Dor HaMidbar. Okay? So there's a really, interesting idea. The Ramban many times points out that ein mita below chet. I feel like the Ramban here is making the same point, which is you have to die for a sin. It's not possible that a human being lives a sinless life and dies, right? And we've mentioned this before, the nishika that God gives to tzaddikim, where he takes their breath away if a person actually lived long enough without any sin. But those are exceptions. For the most part, not for the most part, the rule is that sin, that death is introduced into this world by sin. And I wonder if he says, aval bamidbar meit al mitato, either he meit al mitato, nobody just dies al mitato. They die because they sinned. And so the Ramban thinks that the daughters of Zelophchad are distancing from Korach, which was a really, really wise decision, either because the halacha was that they're not Yoresh Eretz Yisrael, or because Moshe Rabbeinu hated them, and Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't support the claim of the daughters of Korach, of the daughters of Zelophchad, if he was part of Adat Korach. Why did Zelophchad die? His own sin. Everybody dies because they sin, and that applies here. And now the last, maybe not such a modern pshat. O Kediv Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, HaMishorer, right? The famous Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Zal. Sheperush shehu davek im ubanim lo hayulo. Kashe yomar hayom ba'avonot ira, kach v'kach. Ramban says the last possible pshat is the sin was that he had no sons, right? He would have had sons had he not been punished. Now, maybe nowadays there are people who have only daughters and it's not considered a sin, and I certainly wouldn't think it's a sin if you have only daughters. But it could be that if you're one of the Yotzei Mitzrayim and you're coming to Eretz Yisrael and the inheritance is patrilineal, it's from man to man, it is a bad thing. It's not just a technicality that you have only daughters and not sons. It's a bad thing. And the Ramban sees it in the Pasuk. The sin, how do I know that he sinned? Well, he sinned because he had only daughters and not sons. Okay, not a very modern pshat, but it's all in the Ramban. So this connects to the previous Ramban that we saw in Perek Chavav Pasuk Tes, right, in the middle of the Kant, where it says that Hu dasan v'aviram asher hitzu al Hashem b'adas Korach. That's why it's in the middle of the count, to tell us that he didn't inherit. And it ties into this Ramban about the Benos Zelophchad, making it absolutely clear that they were not responsible and that their father had nothing to do with the sin of Korach. Okay, back inside. Let's look at the Ramban. We're going backwards in time, back to the count. It's Perek Chavav, Pasuk Yud Gimel. There the Torah says something interesting. Well, in the middle of the count, the point is the count is by Shevet and also by Mishpachot. And a big discussion in the Rishonim, starting with Rashi, is, as I mentioned before, who inherited? Was it that you left Mitzrayim and therefore you got a claim to Eretz Yisrael, or was it later? And here the problem in this section is that some of the Mishpachot were ba'ei Mitzrayim, and some of them were not. And the Ramban has a very, very interesting take on this whole idea of the families that are highlighted in the count. Says the Ramban, Aval ha'inyan, ki haya ha'minhag bi-Yisrael la'asot lahem rashei batei avot. Right, the minhag was to have a leader of the family. It doesn't mean the nuclear family. It means larger than that. Yityachasu kol yotzei yirecho la'olam el ha'ish hahu. And everybody is basically, related to or given the relation of this person. V'yikru al shemo lichvodo. So it's not just that I come from Shevet Yehuda, but I come from Mishpachat Nemuel. Kasher yasu gam hayom kol hayishmaelim v'chol Yisrael hadarim ba'artzotam lehikare kulam lemishpachat. For example, Ibn Ezra, Ibn Shoshan, right? Says the Ramban, those are popular names. One of the ways we stop ourselves from assimilating is not just by being part of a shevet, but by being part of, forgive the use of the term, a clan. Right? Arabs have clans, and that's how they identify themselves. And if you're part of a clan, then you have an identity, and it's harder for you to leave that clan. And there's all these security interests and whatever. And so if you're Ibn Shoshan or Ibn Ezra, the son of, right? Ibn means the son of, then you're part of a clan. And the Ramban thinks the idea of clans was a Jewish idea, and it started in Mitzrayim. Zeh shene'amar eila rashei beit avotam ki me'eit asher paru v'ravu b'Mitzrayim hamidu lahem rashei mishpachot lityaches alehem. Shvatim got really, really big, really, really quickly. So you needed a leader of your family, and that was not an appointed job. V'ulai hitchilu ha'inyan hazeh b'Mitzrayim shelo yitarev b'goyim. Right, as I mentioned before, you wanted to not assimilate, so this idea started in Mitzrayim. V'yu nachrim v'yiduim l'shivtehem, nikarim v'yiduim l'shivtehem, and you'll be known to be part of this clan. Shesham alu shivatim shivteika edus liYisrael, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, v'atihi lechok b'Yisrael. Now, who are the leaders of the clans? V'hinei hayu eila hanizkarim kan b'Mitzrayim ish l'rosh beit avotav tityaches hamishpacha elav. The people who stepped up in Mitzrayim, the people who were leaders in Mitzrayim, they became the leaders of the clan. Ulakach yimneh bebayit bebeit malchir mishpachat hamachiri umishpachat hagiladi beno umishpachat ha'ezri v'hachelki banav v'achehem uben mibnei Yehuda ve'Ephraim. Now, where do they come from? Ki habanim ha'ela hanizkarim gidolim v'nichbadim v'hiyu l'rosh. They earned their reputations, they earned their greatness, and then they became the heads of clans. Lo hayazeh ba'avur holidam mishpacha rabba kidvrei harab. It's not that the families listed here had so many descendants. Ki kulam holidu mishpachot rabot. Everybody had a lot of descendants. Ki paruva yishritzu vayibru vayatzmu b'ma'od ma'od. Everybody had tons of children in Mitzrayim. That was the bracha. Aval hayazeh lichvod likavod sheshimo aleihem rosh v'rov hamishpachot bihiyotam b'Mitzrayim hayu mityachasot el hayordim leMitzrayim shehem lahem ha'avot hanichbadim. Right? So most people said, I'm part of the clan, and the clan was led by somebody who actually was the Ba'ei Mitzrayim, who came down with Yaakov to Mitzrayim. V'asha'ar asu lahem min hanoladim sham bikarov rashei ha'avot. And the rest became part of clan leaders who made a name for themselves while in Mitzrayim already. V'lachein yihiyu lahem rov hanizkarim kan yordei Mitzrayim. So the Ramban says, like Rashi, yes, most of the heads of the families were yordei Mitzrayim. They came down to Mitzrayim. V'hinei yeh yichus hamishpacha ha'ela liyordei Mitzrayim ki sham tiknu otam. Right? It makes sense that you will miyaches yourself all the way back to the person who came down to Mitzrayim, and you establish that clan. But says the Ramban, there were others who made a name for themselves. Certainly Ephraim and Manasseh didn't come down to Mitzrayim. They were born there. So they had descendants who made themselves leaders of the Shvatim, who made themselves leaders of the clans. And therefore, says the Ramban, in this week's parasha, we have not just 12 Shvatim, but 70 clans to make the identity of Bnei Yisrael more secure. Right? You're less likely to assimilate if you belong not just to a shevet, but you belong to a clan also. Okay, now, after the count and before the karbanot, obviously Pinchas is famous for the karbanot musafim, which hopefully we'll have a few seconds to touch on at the end. But you have God's statement to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's like a break in the action, and the Ramban has a really, really fascinating idea about how it works. So says the Torah, 4 in Chav Zayin, after Zelophchad, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe alei al har ha'avarim hazeh ure'eh et ha'aretz asher natati livnei Yisrael v'ra'ito tov v'ne'esafta el amecha gam ata ka'asher ne'esaf aron achicha. Why? Because you sinned at Mei Merivah. So what should follow this parsha? The parsha should be Vayas Kain Moshe, and he went up to Har HaAvarim and he looked at the land, and then he died. But that doesn't happen. And the Ramban has a great insight into how you understand certain psukim. He says, I'm in the wrong place. He says, Alei al Har HaAvarim hazeh. First of all, technical problem. What's Har HaAvarim? Didn't Moshe die on Har Nevo? So he says, Shem ha'har hazeh Har Nevo. Kasher pireish b'seder ha'azino. No, that's where Moshe died. U'bezot ha'bracha. Aval yikru'u oto Har ha'avarim mipnei shehu al ma'abarot ha'yarden u'misham yavru al eretz Canaan kasher amar kan asher al pnei yirecho v'sham avru at ha'yarden. Okay? Har ha'avarim means la'avor. Since it was on the gateway to the Yarden and to Yericho, so they had to pass through it. So the Ramban, okay, it had a nickname. Its real name was Har Nevo. We're right, that's where Moshe died. But Har HaAvarim simply says it was in a place in which Bnei Israel had to pass in order to enter Eretz Yisrael. Now, the bigger point that we mentioned before, why doesn't Moshe respond to this and do it? Says the Ramban, Ve'einena mitzvah sheyitzavenu hakadosh baruch hu la'asod kein ata. This is not a mitzvah, it's not a commandment that God is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, you need to do this now. She'im kein hiyeh mitchayev la'alot shamiyad, then he'd have to go up immediately. Aval ta'amo, what it really means is ta'aleh al har ha'avarim v'ra'ita et ha'aretz ki ba'avur shetzivahu la'aretz teichalei ka'aretz hodio ki lo al yadcha techila ki ata ta'aleh l'rosh har ha'avarim terem sheyisu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Moav v'tamut bo. Right? Why was it necessary here? So the Ramban says it was necessary because God is telling Moshe that the chalukas ha'aretz is going to be to this group of people. And Moshe had every reason to think he was going to do the chalukah. So God interrupted ki'ilu, the narrative, to say to Moshe, no. When they go to Eretz Yisrael, you're going to go up on the mountain, and that's where you're going to die. V'lo yigi'acha min ha'aretz levad ha'ri'iyah. You don't get to go into Eretz Yisrael, you just get to see it. V'chein kach lechat Yoshua. Bevo yomcha tikachet Yoshua. V'hishlim ha'katuv l'saper ki asa kein Moshe b'lev shalem. Right? The greatness of Moshe is that he did it willingly. Maybe he's hinting to the Medrash that says Moshe really wanted his children to succeed him. But no, he did it himself. He did it in an excited fashion. V'hu ha'asiyah asher yazkir be'eit pitirat Moshe ka'asher amru hashira hu v'hoshea bin Nun. Right? The Ramban knows Chumash. And the Ramban says, this isn't where this takes place. When it says that Moshe did it here, it doesn't mean Moshe did it here chronologically. It's just kind of completing the theme. When did Moshe do it? So there's two places. First, after the Shira Sazinu, Vayomer Vayavo Moshe Vaydaber did kol divrei Shira Zot Bosnei Am Hu v'Hoshea bin Nun. Moshe said Parshas Ha'azinu together with Yehoshua to make it clear that Yehoshua was succeeding him. Similarly, in Vayelech, Vayomer Hashem Moshe hein kavu yamech halamud k'ro'el Yehoshua v'yityatzvu be'ol moed va'atzavenu Vayelech Moshe v'Yehoshua v'yityatzvu be'ol moed. This is when Moshe transfers the baton when Moshe makes Yoshua his successor. And that leads us to the next Ramban. Vitzivita oto, in Pasuk Yutes, the Torah tells us you should command Yehoshua. What is that? So Rashi says, what do you command him? Al Yisrael. Da shetarchanin heim v'sarvanin heim. You have to tell him, Bnei Yisrael are very difficult people to lead. Al menashe tikabel alecha lashon Rashi. Right? If you want to be the leader, says Rashi, Moshe tells Yoshua, if you want to be the leader, you have to know how difficult these people are to lead. You have to know what kind of problems you're going to have, which is a little depressing. And the Ramban rejects it completely. Ve'eino nachon be'enai, ba'avur she'amar le'einehem. The idea was that what Moshe is going to tell Yoshua will be le'einehem, will be in front of all of Klal Yisrael. And it's just a common sense point of the Ramban. Ki yoter ra'ui ha'inyan hazeh laha'amino beino leveino. If Moshe is going to tell Yoshua, listen, Bnei Yisrael are a difficult group, he would tell that to him privately. Ki bifnehem yigrom bahem hitpakrut. If he says it in front of Bnei Yisrael, they'll rebel, they'll get upset, they'll be frustrated. Umiderach hamusar sheyazhir lahem bifnei atzman miyotan o tarchanim v'sarvanim. So what did he tell him? Aval vitzivito to le'einehem, that which you should command Bnei Yisrael, you should command Yehoshua in front of Bnei Yisrael, sheyitzavenu b'mitzvat hanagid v'hashofet. You're appointing Yehoshua now to a very important job, to be the leader. Ki ba'avur heyoto l'rosh yafkidem biyado v'yazhirenu lihishtadel ma'od b'inyanam v'lihiyot nilcham milchamot Hashem v'yehu hamotzi v'hamevi otam ulihizaher b'dvar hamishpat v'zeh ra'ui lihiyot le'einehem kidei sheyavtichu bo v'yishma'u elav. The Ramban is sensitive to something that I think Rashi is not sensitive to. The Ramban says, this is the most significant transference of power ever. In substance, Yoshua was not Moshe Rabbeinu. He was not Pe'el Pe'adaber bo b'marev v'lo b'chidot utmunat Hashem yabit. Moshe needed to show to Klal Yisrael that Yehoshua really was his worthy successor. He needed to charge Yehoshua. It needed to be a ceremony. And says the Ramban, that's what it was. It wasn't an opportunity for Moshe to tell Yehoshua Lashon Hara on Bnei Yisrael, or maybe not Lashon Hara, just the facts. It was an opportunity to build Yehoshua up. And says the Ramban, it didn't really happen in Pinchas. This is just Moshe Rabbeinu needed to know right now that he wasn't going into Eretz Yisrael. And so the Torah says nice things, and the Torah tells him what he should do. But he doesn't do it till the end of Devarim. He doesn't do it till Vayelech, he doesn't do it till Ha'azinu. And then he did exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him to do. And then he built Yoshua up. And the plan was a big plan, and the sense that Yoshua was a worthy successor only came about because Moshe Rabbeinu did it. And he did it. And then right there, that's why you find Vayomer Hashem Moshe, right after that, Hein kavu yamecha lamut krad Yoshua v'yityatzvu b'ol moed va'atzavenu va'elech Moshe v'Yoshua v'yityatzvu b'ol moed. And then he's going to command him, Vayira Hashem b'ol moed ba'amud anan vayamod amud ha'anan el pesach ha'oel vayomer Hashem el Moshe hincha shochevim avotecha. Okay, you're about to die. So the end, the commandment in Pinchas does not actually take place in Pinchas chronologically. It takes place at the end of Devarim. And the Ramban, who's so sensitive to this idea of Ein Mukdam or Yesh Mukdam Muchar B'Torah, points out to us here something we might not have noticed, which is you might think the whole story takes place in Pinchas. No, Pinchas is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe to do it. But it's not an immediate command. Moshe understood it to happen in time. And it happens, a few weeks later or a month and a half later, right? Really, we're at the end of the Torah. We're standing on the Ever HaYarden. We're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. We forget, because Devarim is so long, we forget that chronologically this is the end. This is the time. And so Moshe Rabbeinu knew he was going to have to appoint Pinchas. Okay, we're just about out of time. Just one comment on V'tzavet Bnei Yisrael Marta Lemet Karbani Lachmi Liishai. The Ramban points out that the Musafim were only noeg in Eretz Yisrael. Why are these karbanos mentioned here and not in Amor where the other karbanot are mentioned? So Ramban says, because the Musafim are only brought in Eretz Yisrael. Does that mean that the Ramban thinks that the Musafim were mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz? No. But the fact of the matter is, we only became a nation. That's probably why I think the Ramban thinks that the Yom Tovim weren't really noeg in the Midbar. Shabbos was noeg in the Midbar, but the Yom Tovim, it didn't make that much sense. We don't really become Bnei Yisrael, says the Ramban. We don't really become Klal Yisrael. We don't really become a people till we enter Eretz Yisrael. When we enter Eretz Yisrael, then we have all the Musafim. So then why is the Tamid mentioned here? So the Ramban says, yeah, the Torah cheated. Torah wanted to put, it is true that the Tamid Shel Shach and Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim were mentioned in Tetzaveh. They don't have to be commanded here. But says the Ramban, it's good for us. If you're a Baal Koreh, if you follow this stuff, you want to get all the karbanos in one place. Right? If you want to know where the karbanos listed, they're listed in Pinchas. And that includes the Tamid Shel Shach and the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim. They are not Musafim, but you want to put all these, all of the karbanos that are brought on a particular schedule, you want to put them together and you want to give them mitzvahs to Klal Yisrael before they enter Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so we saw a lot of different interesting things. No big theme today in the Ramban, but certainly the idea of Dasan v'Aviram and Moshe's frustration / maybe even hatred of them, and why Zelophchad didn't want to be identified with him. The idea of clans in Bnei Yisrael, it's important to have a self-identity to prevent assimilation. The Ramban thinks that the 70 families listed in the count were not necessarily of a certain type. They were all great people who established clans around them. And then finally, the two Rambans where HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu to command Yehoshua, the Ramban thinks it was a ceremony, it was a big deal. It wasn't a time for telling them negative things about Klal Yisrael. It was a time for showing that Yehoshua was a worthy successor of Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore he commanded them to do so. And finally, the Karbanot, the interesting thing we saw there. Yashkach to everybody. Shabbat Shalom to all. See you next week.